Great.
Hi, Shanna.
Thank,
Doing good.
good. Thanks for joining me tonight. Tonight we are going to talk about purity culture and white supremacy. So that's a big topic. Um, just to give a little background, as you all know, we're doing a series on purity culture, and this shows up in a lot more ways than I realized when I started looking into it. And one of those ways is purity of race, or holding up this ideal image of what a person should look like, and that is generally um, when in purity culture, and I think in our church, when we look to what the ideal is, like looking to the platform, for example, brother sister workers, we usually see someone who is white, right? Um, and so I think tonight we're going to start to unpack that a bit. Um, and for myself, um, until a few years ago, and still now, of course, I viewed myself as someone who was very anti-racism, anti-white supremacy. Those are not things that I approved of. However, as I've starting to educate myself and learning from my friends, like you guys here tonight and others, and reading, I started to understand that there were a lot of experiences that I didn't know about. Um, there were ways that the systems that I live in, my country, schools, my church, upheld racist views or white supremacist views. Um, and another thing that I realized and that I'm trying to work on is that I have privilege in these systems because I'm white. And so that means that I need to learn more about that and how that affects my life and how that affects those around me. And part of that is me taking responsibility for educating myself and not always expecting people of color, for example, to do that educating for me because they already are doing so much in their own lives, right? And running into these to racism and white supremacy in their daily lives. So I want to say a huge thank you to Claude and Su-Mei for joining us tonight to talk about this. Um, I know it's not always easy for them, and there's a cost associated with it. And it's not their responsibility, frankly, to teach us about racism and white supremacy. But I'm really thankful that they chose to do that tonight. And I think we'll talk towards the end too about a lot of resources where we can go, those of us who are white, to educate ourselves about these things and how we can show up and be an ally for people of color that we're in community with. Um, so as we get started, when we started about talking about having this conversation, initially I had approached Claude and Su-Mei and said, "Hey, let's talk about racism." And Su-Mei came back to me and she said, "Well, hey, how about we talk about white supremacy?" So I said, "Okay, that sounds good." But Su-Mei, can you tell me a little bit about why you asked that question and what is the difference between those two things, racism and white supremacy? I can't hear you super well.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that. So before I address that question, I just wanted to express my thankfulness, Shanna, for your attitude and for the efforts that you've put in to create this space. Because, if we're talking about issues related to white supremacy and racism, um, you have enough privilege that you don't have to try. So like this is something that I feel that you have put in an effort to do. That maybe a lot of people with similar identities and backgrounds may not feel that they have to do. And so I just wanted to thank you for making that effort. So the reason why I thought that white supremacy would be a better theme than racism is really because I think it is a more targeted concept that applies more immediately to the context that we find ourselves in or have found ourselves in, um, mainly the two church. And the thing to understand is that both racism and white supremacy are ideologies. right? And it is from these ideologies that we've built systems of oppression, right? Racism is an ideology that proposes that there are superior races and inferior races, right? And that we should create a world, right, where some races, the superior races, dominate and the inferior races are dominated, right? So it's really a system or a set of systems that are power based, right? It's a distribution of power, privilege, resources, and things like that, right? Amongst these different categories. Now, of course, these so-called races are not biological in nature. They're really socially constructed. In the history of our own country, right, race has been quite a fluid concept, okay? Particularly whiteness, right, as a race, right? Usually we think of it as European, right? But in the past, we've had, moments where the Irish were not considered white, the Italians were not
Mm.
considered white, right? So it's socially constructed. So white supremacy is kind of like a subset of racism as an ideology, right? And so it posits that the white race is superior to all other races, right? And this justifies the building of systems of oppression, right? Where only one race dominates and everyone else basically has to scramble and scrape, right? For whatever, the superior race has deemed, their benevolence to give, right? And so it's really important to understand that I think, at least what I've seen and experienced in the 2x2 church is white supremacy,
Mm.
not racism. Racism,
Okay.
like it could be all, the Chinese, for example, right? If you think about China as an empire, at one point, the Han Chinese, right, thought that all other ethnic groups, right, are inferior to the Han Chinese. So you could
Mm.
think of that as a form of racism, but we're not talking about that, right? We're talking very specifically about the white race, right, being dominant, right? And
Hmm.
I have experienced a lot of that manifest in different ways, and intersecting with gender to create purity culture, right? And it's many, different manifestations in very interesting ways, unfortunate and interesting ways.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, May.
And I just wanted to add that, not that I really should, because Su-Mei was quite comprehensive, but I just wanted to clarify that oftentimes people will confuse prejudice and racism, or prejudice and white supremacy, and they're not the same. Because as Su-Mei pointed out, racism and white supremacy are systems. They're a systemic ordering that keeps one group at the top and others in subservience. Prejudice is just, I don't like that type of person. That in and of itself does not make oppression happen. A system whereby people are forbidden housing, they're not allowed to get loans, they're redlined into certain districts as far as applying for mortgages. Those are systemic issues. And so when you order a society based on that type of assumption, that is racism, and in more specificity for this discussion, white supremacy. Because in the United States, it's been the concept of whiteness and this group conceived as white, which, as Su-Mei rightly pointed out, has been fluid and has shifted. And certain, even within the European countries, certain Europeans were not considered white at certain points. And what we generally find historically is that as the group that is considered white sees itself on a trajectory of minority grouping, then it begins to subsume another group that it can argue is
Uh,
white. So
mm.
as the, let's say it started with English and Germans and French, and then as those of those backgrounds now begin to have their population numbers dwindle, then it's like, well, I mean, what's next? We can bring in the Irish and we can bring in the Italians now. So now they're suddenly they are brought into this concept of whiteness, whereas they were eschewed before. Now they're welcomed, right? So that essentially, as Su-Mei said, it's not a biological construct. This is a mental game essentially, because you can reorder if the powers that be decide that Su-Mei is worthy now to be considered white, she would be welcomed into the society of whiteness, right? So it's a concept. So it is very important to keep those definitions not muddied, because prejudice is not the same as white supremacy, and it's not the same as racism. And to Sumei's point, white supremacy is a very specific type of racism, which is appropriate to this particular sect, because
Thank you.
the overseers themselves, by and large, are all white men.
Hmm.
When anyone is to be laid hands on, I've not even heard a discussion of any people of color being selected for consideration to be brought into that number, to be have hands laid on to name them overseers. And so oftentimes even within staffs, unless a person of color has reached a advanced age, it takes a while for them to become even senior preachers, right? They're generally the junior level preacher. So so in many ways, and just the way that this sect operates, it echoes and reaffirms systems of white supremacy, but now has an overlaying authority of spirituality and biblical authority on top of it when it uses that to press its point of view, press that particular
Hmm.
perspective.
Yeah.
Claude, I really appreciate the fact that you brought up this point that, if you look at who's in charge, right, in the two by two church, right, is invariably white men. Because have been taught, right, and we continue to be taught that actually God is the one who calls, right, these people, right, to be their servant, his servant. And so if you accept that order, that means you accept that you worship a racist, white supremacist God. That is just logical, right? Similarly, one of the reasons why I found it very difficult and a huge struggle for me throughout the 30 over years that I was in the meetings is that, we were always taught that, we were called into this kingdom, right? And if you look around you, for the most part, unless you are actually in a country that is non-white, right? The majority of people are white. So that to me means that God considers people of color to be unworthy,
Mm.
inherently unworthy. So therefore, if you accept this order, right, without any kind of critical, understanding that, this is clearly a very inequitable system, right, then you are actually accepting the notion that God is racist.
Mm. Wow, that's very powerful, Sume. And I think, yeah, that's right in line with the other things we've been talking about in purity culture is when these systems and when these teachings come from people who claim to be anointed by God and be speaking for God, that gets all tied up in our spirituality, our concept of who God is, our concept of ourself and our self-worth, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because to Sumei's point, if you look around and there's only you or very few who look like you, then that
Hmm.
means that God's not calling anyone like you, or
Yeah.
that you just happen to be lucky enough to be responsive, or
Yeah.
your parents happen to be lucky enough to be responsive, and that by and large, people who look like you are incapable of hearing the call of God.
Yeah.
And further to that point, when you would look at missions, where they're held, I mean, I know we've gotten off topic here, but where they're held are in places, generally speaking, where people of color don't
Mm.
exist to hear such a call. So
Right.
if you call, if you call for goats in a pen full of sheep, you're not going to get any goats, and vice versa, right? So if you
Yeah.
so yeah, it does reinforce a picture that you accept that God is only calling certain ones, and if you happen to be a person of color, that you are especially lucky because he seems to generally not call anyone when you if you logically follow the chain of what you're told, that God calls those that are his preachers, that he sends them forward to call followers, and that they call the ones that he sends them to, right? And where he sends them to.
Yeah.
So if people like you exist in the nation that you're in, but you don't see very many more like you, it makes it appear as though God is sending them elsewhere or is disinterested and more like you,
Mm-hmm.
or it's very difficult for him to call to anyone who looks like you, right? There's
Yeah.
all these other kind of mental games you have to play in order to keep
Right.
yourself as a part of that membership.
But we know, of course, that that actually isn't true, and that's not the way,
Correct.
God is.
Correct. Correct.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for
Because,
clarifying
one,
that. Yeah.
because I'll tell you, I mean, if I may share just very quickly, one of the last experiences that, helped us to see with more clarity that, this was not a place that, we could really find God, is, at toward the end of our time in the 2 by 2 church, we actually talked to the workers that were in our field about this. Right. And we said, we're willing to support you financially, and morally and spiritually, to go into areas that are not predominantly
Hmm.
white in the cities. And they actually refused.
Really?
Yeah. And one of them said, these are dangerous places where, we may be shot and killed.
Wow.
So, it's about, people's comfort zone, right? Prisons that they have, basically placed themselves in, because of their unexamined biases, right? Yeah. So, this is not, to me, this is not where God can be found, because God is, to me, not only a just God, but a God that gives courage.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So then
Well,
to bring that back now to the
hmm
discussion of purity culture, as you were pointing out, Shanna, that it holds this concept of whiteness as like a paragon of purity. And generally speaking, the white woman is considered the height of purity.
hmm
So the prospect of her being dated by anyone other than a white man is seen as like a debauchery, making her
hmm
impure, making her soiling her in some sense, right? So when, especially the churches that are very enamored with purity culture, would not only encourage um, that people did not have sexual relations before marriage and so on for making themselves pure, but they would also encourage that people would marry people from similar backgrounds. Like for myself,
Ah.
I remember that there was a woman that we were just friends, but I wasn't sure if something could come of it. It would have been fine, if something had come of it. But she is a white person. I am me, and my understanding secondhand was that that someone spoke to her and said, it's not a good idea for you to pursue
Wow.
a romantic relationship with him. And then when I was engaged to my wife, now wife, Rebecca, when she's my fiance, as we were now affianced, I got an email from someone who is a longtime family friend, a white person that I met with for many years. And their advice was that, the races are so different and the cultures are
Mm.
so different, and that it's so important that God wants to see successful unions, that it would be a tragedy for us to make this step and not think it through and make something that's already difficult even harder, and potentially have just start off with a whole union on the wrong foot because it was just so unequal, because our backgrounds were so different.
I'm
And
sorry, Claude. I'm sorry that you ever had to read anything like that.
so those experiences, those are not unique to me. I know of
hmm
other people who are, mixed background couples that were also encouraged or discouraged from continuing to date, encouraged not to date or discouraged from dating, however you
So
want to
my
look at
question is not really for you, but like for these people who are saying that. you guys just said that you looked around and you didn't see anyone like you. So how are you supposed to find someone to partner with?
Travel. For my own case, I should be running to the Caribbean to find someone who looks like me, or the continent of Africa,
Wow.
right? Or maybe bring someone in who looks like me, right?
Wow.
That would be the encouragement. So so if you look at that, I
So
mean,
it's
if
like one step farther in purity culture. Like for us as white people, like the expectation was that we marry someone professing. So that's one step of purity, right?
right,
But for you, there's like this extra step of purity of race. Like you're supposed to stay with the same race.
right, right,
Wow.
and it now so for me, like if for me to date a Latina, that might not be
Mm-hmm.
as big of a deal, right?
Okay.
But for me to date someone white, that would be a big,
White. White is the key.
and that is the key because as Su-Mei said, it's not just racism. We're talking about white supremacy, and
Yeah.
so for me, you know, in their minds, punching above my weight to go and
Mm-hmm.
ask my now wife to marry me.
Yeah.
That's just it's just not done. It's not correct. And so, how can God bless such a union if it's starting on just such an unequal footing? So those type of things, I'm not the only person that has had those type of instances. As a matter of fact, after we were married, we had a woman preacher at our place for dinner, and we noticed another mixed race couple
Mm-hmm.
we thought that they were interested in one another. They had gone
Mm.
on a couple walks, black guy and white
Couple
girl.
walks. Yeah.
And this lady preacher was irate. She reacted
Really.
very strongly and she snapped at us and said, everyone keeps saying that they're interested in one another, but they're just friends. She insisted that they're just friends.
Mm.
It's very important to her that they were just friends, nothing romantically inclined. But I've never seen, as far as conventions go, that a man and a woman go on a walk as just friends. Generally speaking, when that happens, as far as the context of this particular sect, if you
Yeah.
go out on a walk, man
That
and
meant
woman,
something, right?
that means something.
Yeah.
That is an expression of romantic interest. Whether that gets pursued further or not, that's up for discussion. But that just the very act of a man and a woman going out on a walk at
Yeah.
convention in that setting, especially given that most couplings in this sect happen around convention time, it's a clear indicator that there's interest there to date and to further a romantic relationship.
Yeah.
So her reaction, I was surprised at because she's also someone that I'd known for a little bit. And I was surprised
Yeah.
to see her react so aggressively, so hostile
Yeah.
to that prospect. So the long story short was Rebecca and I were right because these people did eventually marry, but it was so important to her at the time that we weren't
Yeah.
pushing them together because we had a lens in on our own eyes in her
Mm-hmm.
mind that was forcing them together and that we were seeing something that just wasn't there, that they're
Mm.
just friends when
I
in
see.
by all evidence, by all observable evidence, especially within the context of this sect and the practices, the mating dances of this particular sect,
Mm-hmm.
it couldn't have been clearer that there was
Yeah.
romantic interest in both parties, and that was
Yeah.
why these walks took place.
Yeah.
So,
Claude, I'm, listening to you and smiling, only because, as shocking as it may seem to those who, believe that, we live in a world that is post-racial, um, this is something that is very recognizable to me
Mm.
because it's happened to me as well, right? There are a lot of assumptions made about, why some people are superior and others are inherently inferior. So I'll just give you a more benign example. That is after, Mark and I had already been married. When people first meet us, they would often assume that, I was a worldly person whom Mark had met.
Oh. Oh,
and
okay.
help to civilize and to save, right? So they asked me, so like, how did you meet and when did you start coming to meetings? And of course I had, professed before my husband in a different country, right? Quite, we didn't even know each other at the time, but there was always this assumption that, like he saved me. He brought me
Uh-huh.
into the fold, right? Which is the white man's burden to do, right? So, it's very interesting how, these kinds of narratives, they permutate and they become very interesting, like stories of that we tell ourselves about who we are in relation to others, right?
Hmm.
And how people should relate to one another in this world. And so, marriages like what Claude and I have upset the order of things.
Hmm.
And so I have to say that, some of the most difficult aspects of our marriage have actually been the people around us, creating issues and pressures, right, that were really not necessary, right? Um, the other thing I wanted to say was that, I'm always very interested to know if this is still the same today, because of course Claude and I are of a certain vintage, right? So I'm always interested to know, like, oh, is this the experience of, young folks now, right? Like 16, 17, falling in love and all that, if race is still, an issue, right? But whatever it is, whether things have changed or not, right? I feel like, if you make this very high claim that you are the only true way, right? That only you have been given this understanding of the truth, then you actually have a very huge responsibility to lead society, not follow 4 or 5 decades behind,
Mhm.
right?
Hmm.
So, actually in the meetings, right? Marriages like what Claude and I have, right? Those should be upheld, right? As examples of how we have transcended the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a
But
really
they're
interesting
not.
point. Yeah.
They're not. So that's another thing that helped me understand the fallacy of the things that we're taught,
Hmm.
right? And the things that we are not interested in living into at all.
Yeah.
Because to your point, Shanna, earlier, you said that it was very important that you couple with somebody who was professing.
Yeah.
So Rebecca and I, we both were going to the meetings. We both were raised in these meetings. We both had experienced life experience being raised as infancy, from infancy straight to adulthood in these meetings, going to gospel meetings, going to Sunday mornings, going to conventions. So if that is the thing that is most important, we both had that in common.
Right.
And when you hear that nothing matters but salvation, and that the things of this world are temporal and pass away, and that this is the only true way, and that all that matters is the spiritual, well, we had that in common. So if that is the thing that's most important, what should have been encouraged is that, it's very admirable that two people who have the same value set and the same spiritual leaning are coupling up. The other
Yeah.
thing that was interesting is that the point that was made that our union would be more fragile because of
Hmm.
our different backgrounds is, in hindsight now, it's comical because many of the same grouping couples that we'd seen, whether they're, most of them both white, that were celebrated, there have been quite a few of those that have split up while we've been married. It's going to be 20 years this year. So I think that, especially given that, when you're part of this sect, I mean, neither Rebecca or I are any longer. We've also left, but we were part of it. And while you're part of this sect, you know, um, you know that you're not removed from the forces of real life. Like you're not exempted from racism. You're not exempted from white supremacy and prejudice. So even though you're dating another, at the time, professing person, that doesn't exempt you from incidences of racism and escaping that just in the general public, in the world at large. So you know that going in, and you still embark on this union, knowing that going in. So for someone to lecture you after the fact, after you've already built a rapport,
Hmm.
after you've had romantic feelings grow between the two of you, it actually is a discounting of your own perception, your own observation, your own
Mm,
ability to work through logic, because you would have known that immediately. You know that you look differently. You know that this
yeah.
world suffers from racism, right? In and throughout. So you would know that as you embarked on the relationship. That wouldn't have been new to you. It wouldn't have dawned on you all of a sudden after you'd become, romantically involved.
Yeah.
So,
And I think, Claude, what you're touching on here when you mentioned difference a lot and like the worry about difference. And I think this underlying tenet of purity culture that we see in this church that upholds white supremacy is this drive, this need for uniformity and conformity, both, right? Like that is so important that everyone look the same, dress the same,
mhm,
present to the world the same way. Like differences are scary. They're not celebrated, right? And that just feeds right into this white supremacy ideology,
mhm,
which is so different. Like that's what you were hearing, Claude. Everyone was warning you about, oh, you guys are different. What might happen? Like it's
right.
a bad thing, right? Like scary,
Mhm.
rather than, wow, diversity and difference makes this world a beautiful, interesting place, right?
And interestingly, that was not always the same from all directions, because I'd seen, like I've seen white men that dated Latinas in
Mm.
this fellowship, and that was, isn't that wonderful that they're together? Isn't that what a thing?
Is
And
that
I'd
what Su-Mei
seen,
was talking
and
about
I've and
them
I'd
bring?
seen white guys with Asian women, and it's like, oh, that's so wonderful. So, is it wonderful because it's the diversity? Is it wonderful because in
Mm.
Sumei's description that he's saving her from, whatever loss or whatever it is, that he's bringing her to this one true way, and how else would she have found it without this fellow, this this fellow here to come to bring her to
I have a
this?
question, Claude. So, do you think that is also different because they're men, white men,
Yes, I
bringing
do.
women of color
Yes, I do.
versus
Yes, I do. Because
men of color, right?
that has not been the same if I've seen it with a white woman,
Right,
engaged, looking toward for a relationship with a
right.
black man or a
That was my
Latino,
question. That
quite
was my
frankly.
question.
If I may interject at this point though, because I feel like, I have to say that, my marriage to Mark was not necessarily celebrated in the UK,
Mm,
where he came from. And I'll be very frank with you, that was not considered ideal by his
Mm,
family, actually. I think there was a sense that, I was this exotic
mm,
person, that was sort of like a temptress, right? That basically took away an eligible bachelor for the white women
mm.
there in the meetings. And I
Wow,
had no business doing that.
wow.
So I think the workers tried to split us up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Um, so, I do want to make sure
Yeah.
that, understood that because um I think sometimes Asians are considered to be white approximating.
Hmm.
But in reality, that has not really been my experience.
Yeah.
Um, I have experienced many times when, it was made clear to me that, we're definitely not superior.
Hmm.
Um, and we should know our place.
Hmm. You bring up an interesting point, Sume. Like, there's still a variety of experiences, right? And
Mhm.
you had talked before our call. I don't know if you want to talk about it at all right now, but just the difference too, and like how white supremacy is experienced in the US versus the UK, in other countries, that it's not the
Mhm.
same.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not, it's, yeah. But also another thing I wanted to say from a an Asian woman's perspective, and I say Asian woman, I am an Asian woman, but I don't speak for all Asian women. So,
Mhm.
there may be a variety of experiences as well. But I do know that, there is a certain stereotype of how a virtuous Asian woman should be, and she should not be opinionated.
Mm.
She should not even think those thoughts, but preferably not express it at all, right? And so, I think that, someone who, is perceived to have a certain level of education, a certain kind of job, um, that doesn't fit with that stereotype of what, an Asian woman should be, right? A good Asian woman should be, makes it doubly hard when you do actually have something between your ears, and you're not necessarily holding back, right? And so, that also may have been the problem, but I think that stems from this idea of, the idealized, when we talk about purity culture, we're talking about idealized notions of women, and they're not all the same, based on your race as well, right? So, sexual purity, Asian women have already, lost that one, right? Because you're perceived as these exotic temptresses, right? Since,
Okay.
Edward Said wrote, a book called Orientalism, right? Is how, the exotic East has been represented, right, in the Western imaginary through literature, music, all kinds of, artistic expressions, literature. And so, like the exotic Oriental woman, right? There's already this underlying notion of what, it should be like. And so if you don't conform to that, right, that makes your life doubly hard. Um, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting when you are in a marriage with someone who is white, because then you don't even have that buffer. If I had married someone who was Asian, if I had married someone who was black, I feel like at least do you know what I mean? I don't necessarily have to be exposed to all that
Mm. Hmm.
prejudice all the time. So it has been very hard for me personally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it is important to for me to note also because, as Su-Mei said, she doesn't speak for all Asian women, and I don't speak for all black men. There may be others who have had a better experience, maybe had experienced none of what I've described, but of those that I know personally, they have. So but I don't know as few of us as it seemed to be. I don't know every black guy that
Mm.
was in this sect. But you also mentioned too about Shanna about the looking to the platform for the example of what you should be, and like how that informs purity culture, like as far as appearance, right? So in Western countries, especially here in the United States, whiteness is considered a default look. Your skin tone is a default. Your hair texture is a default. Your skin needs are a default. Your hair product needs are a default. Your dressing styles are considered the default. So in all manner of ways, you're held as like the default setting of all things. Even in medical testing, actually, it's a white guy
Yeah.
generally that's used as a default for everyone when they get testing pools for medications. So because of that, even the way your appearance is observed as you're attending meeting, it's compared to white guy, white woman. So for black women, black hair textures are not the same
Hmm.
as European hair textures, right? We have curlier hair. And so when they would say, point to say, your hair should look like the sister workers. Well, if it's, a large group of European descended women, your hair doesn't look like that. Your hair doesn't move that way. And in order to make it move that way, you actually have to introduce a toxic lye on your scalp to burn it into submission. That is when people are enduring a permanent that is essentially what is happening to straighten black hair. You are burning that hair. You're singeing it with chemicals to force it straight, and
Hmm.
then now to put that up. And studies have shown now over time that those very chemicals cause cancer. So
Yeah.
you are demanding beauty standards out of people to adhere to a default setting that you've set that their body does not adhere to, right? Even shaving. I remember
Yeah.
as a man growing up, a young man growing up, beards were verboten. It's different now, but growing up in the 70s and 80s, that was like a no-no. That they would ask you if you weren't shaved, if you were still professing, because that was like the mark of a clean-shaven man. Well, for people who have Africanized skin, shaving constantly irritates the skin. You can get ingrown hair bumps and so on. So to demand that a person adhere to, you know, your standards of facial grooming when
Mm.
their skin texture and hair texture is different, because that is perceived as a holy way to appear, right? That
Hmm.
that also is related. And so if a woman dresses differently, if her hair is held differently, if she uses a different skin product that's good for her skin, but it's seen as too showy, too racy, too different, that also would
Yeah.
mark her as trying to stand out, trying to draw attention, as Su-Mei would say, like the temptress, right? When in actuality, you're just using the product that works best for your body. It works best for your skin type, but best for your hairstyle, right? Best for,
Yeah.
but it would be posed as differently, either as a unwillingness, right,
Mm.
to submit to the will of God, but because you're not forcing your hair and skin to adhere to European beauty standards, or that you are doing this expressly to get attention, right? To
Well, and
fetch.
I mean, we've heard how many stories of women, and these stories probably are mostly about white women, but how much more would it apply, who were refused baptism because of their hair length, for example,
Mhm,
or, how they did their hair or how their nails looked, right? Those
mhm,
beauty standards, and then to refuse spiritual rituals because of those that were based on one particular white image, right?
mhm.
I'm always, fascinated that God is actually referred to as male because he
Yeah.
has an amazing ability to multitask. While,
I love that.
well, I mean, the vastness of this universe and beyond, and then there are these nails.
Right?
Wow, that's a lot of management.
That's a lot of management. Exactly. That's a good point, Sume. Oh boy. Um, we were talking earlier. Do you want to talk at all about kind of the missionary structure of the church and colonialism? Get into that at all, or how are you guys feeling?
I'm up for it if Sumei's up for it.
Well, first of all, I feel like I have never had enough clarity about how the whole system works because there's no transparency nor
Hmm.
accountability. So I,
That's a
I'm
very that's a very fair point.
Yeah.
like, how does it work? I mean, obviously you can tell, that there are hierarchies based on race and gender, but like, other than that, I don't really know how it works.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I've observed is that when you hear about who's in charge of countries, right, like abroad, um, I don't know that I've ever heard of someone being in charge who's not a white male. Maybe it's happened once or twice. It's possible. Um,
I understand
but
that India has overseers that
okay,
are from that
okay.
nation, but I also understand that there are certain decisions where another overseer from elsewhere comes in to advise.
Mm,
I think
okay,
assists is the word I think is used, but it seems like more like from my observation, it seems like a consultation, like a.
okay.
But
I
no,
mean,
to that end, I mean, like in the Caribbean, I think it was when my maybe when my parents were there or shortly thereafter, there was a man named Harold McKnight. He was from the UK. He was the overseer of the Caribbean. But you had, at the same time, they would send men and women preachers from those nations to go to conventions to preach elsewhere. And generally speaking, not always, but very often, those who get sent abroad are overseers. So you would have somebody who would come highly respected as far as delivering a sermon, and so much so that they would be in demand to speak in another nation. So they had that much command of the Spirit, apparently, to share a message internationally, but they don't
Mm.
have that much that they can become an overseer. And so I
So you're
I'd
talking about
see.
like people of color that are traveling around as well.
Yes, yes. I
I
mean,
see. Okay.
like for instance, my parents, when they started coming to this sect, they came through a couple workers. One of the men was Jack Campbell, and
Okay.
so he's been primarily in South America and the Caribbean for most of his time. He comes highly regarded, and he's been in the States here for a few different runs on convention time. Many people, when they meet him, they are so complimentary of his spirit, his bearing, his carriage, his poise, right? His gravitas, his message. These are all the things that you would hear from any other, worker that would be in line, poised for an overseership. And then when there would be opportunity for succession in the Caribbean, I would never hear his name come up, not even barely suggested as an overseer. So, he is from the region. He's well regarded in the region. He's well regarded enough that you can send him abroad to the States and UK and other places to share a message. But when it comes time to be entrusted with the guidance of a region, despite all of
Mm.
his tenure and his experience and your obvious admiration of what you believe is his spiritual hold on things that are biblical, spiritual, divine, he still has yet another rung to reach. Meanwhile, we've seen some of the names who have been named overseer, and we've seen what some of them were capable of and have been accused of. So, so it is interesting to see certain ones abroad get passed over for
Mm.
positions of responsibility and see others who are junior to them, maybe in years of service, maybe even not as helpful in understanding as far as listening to their sermons, leapfrog them
Mm.
for positions of responsibility.
Mm.
But to Su-Mei's point, like none of it is clear. You can
Yeah.
only go by the observation of what you're seeing. And so when you see
Mm.
that these
To
lines of
infer.
succession open up, this person leaves, moves, dies, and then it's another white guy that moves in, comes from another area, right? They bring him in from the UK to come, or they bring him, over from Australia to come down, or they bring him down from Canada, right? If at no time are any of the staff, tenured staff in that region, from that region, familiar with the culture of that region, who the people would respond to the best from that region. At no time are they ever seen qualified, regardless of the number of well tenured and well regarded people on those staffs. So it bears examination because although we don't know exactly how things move because it is so secretively organized and the operations are so clandestine, so covert, we can't say with 100% certainty. But you can observe what you do see. And what you do see is a shortage of advancement of people of color in many ways and in many regions. And like in all of Africa, I don't think that there is one black overseer.
Mm.
The continent of Africa is a large landmass, despite what people would want to. It's not the size of Texas. We're talking about a massive landmass continent, and over the entirety of that continent, that is a majority black continent. there is no person of color as an overseer.
Hmm. Hmm. Since we're also talking about period culture, I just wanted to add a gender dimension to this
Mm,
discussion that, because Claude has done a great job pointing out that it's definitely a racial dimension there. And so we don't see many women as well,
mhm.
if at all, right? None at all, actually, right? In positions of formal leadership. Okay. So I think that is related to the ideal type of what a woman should be like, right? Submissive,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be a usurper. And so women also don't reach for those positions, right?
Yeah.
Because that would be, upsetting the order of things and improper, right? Um, so I had a very interesting discussion. Again, one of those interesting discussions that led to me leaving, with a sister worker, right, an older sister worker, who basically said that, when we were talking about patriarchy, right, in the meetings, said that, oh, that was not, her experience. She has had a lot of influence over decisions that were made,
Hmm.
and that the brother workers were very consultative, right? They consulted senior sister workers before they made decisions. And so, therefore, right, it was unfair to say that, the system is patriarchal, discriminates against women, and, excludes women from decision making, right? So I thought that was very interesting because I also feel that, even as we talk about, white supremacy being oppressive, even as we talk about patriarchy, right, being oppressive, I do feel that, if you bear some of these identities, you have some responsibility also in understanding your own oppression and doing
Mm,
something about it and empowering other people to do something about it. And I feel personally that as a, if I were sister worker, right? And I felt that it was enough for me, right, to influence decisions without taking on the responsibility of leadership. What I'm really doing is copping out. Because
mm,
I want an influence on the decision, but I don't want the formal responsibility of it. Someone can take the
mm.
responsibility. The brother worker can take the responsibility. I'm just gonna shape the outcome the way I see fit, right?
Right.
So it's a kind of informal leadership that basically cops out of the full
Mm,
responsibility of leadership. And I think that is disappointing.
yeah.
I'll just be very clear. I
Yeah.
think that is very disappointing. If we want to shape outcomes, we take on the full responsibility of leadership. So when things go wrong, we take that responsibility.
Right.
Why can't we? Right? So that's my own personal opinion. I'm sure not everyone is going to agree. It's a very strong opinion, but I do feel that, although Shanna, you said, it's not our responsibility because we do bear a lot of the brunt. Driving while black is deadly, right? The things that we do on a day-to-day basis that we cannot take for granted that, we will
Yeah.
thrive or we'll come back alive, right? But nevertheless, right, I do think that, it is our responsibility because God made us a certain way so that we can see certain things, that we actually see them for
Mm,
ourselves and take the responsibility to change things. I think that is very important because it is not true to say that there are no people of color. It's certainly not true to say that there are no women
yeah.
in the two by two church. And yet here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's very true, Sume. I think, that's a really important part of having this conversation is when we learn more, then we're responsible for more too, right? And what can we do? And I actually kind of wanted to, as we get towards wrapping up tonight, I wanted to put that out to you guys if you have advice or as far as like how we can educate ourselves more. If you have things that you want us to take away from this conversation, you've taught me so much already tonight, and I really appreciate it. But is there anything else that you'd want to touch on or leave us with?
Sume, you go first, please.
Oh, okay. So I have this resource. It's actually an app that you can download. It's called Movement 10K.
Okay.
And basically, it's an app to help educate people about what white supremacy is, what racism is, the pervasiveness of white supremacy and racism in all our institutions, right? Whether it's political, economic, educational, and then, to help people understand the history of all that. So even just, for example, understanding why the N-word is so hard and so horrible, right? All the history behind that, right? It's really
Hmm.
important. And Claude was, talking to us about that before we started recording this session. And so like things like that, right? They'll teach you so that, you have the historical context you need to understand why it is that, people are not snowflakes. And they don't use certain terms, right? Okay. And then, to empower you to do something about it.
Hmm.
And I think it behoves all of us, regardless of our identities and backgrounds, to, educate ourselves. And can I just share something? As heavy as these kinds of topics are, and as serious as it is, because the harms that are inflicted are very egregious. I have found it personally very enriching, and rewarding to go on this journey of learning.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's very traumatizing, of course.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to hear when people share their experiences, but nevertheless, I feel like a full human being when I learn about these things.
Hmm.
And there's some amazing Black intellectuals that have taken us places where, we would otherwise be too afraid to go. I feel
Yeah.
that, we should reach for these kinds of resources, right? Um, We've talked about James Baldwin and other spaces before. We've talked about bell hooks, right? We have Cornell West, right? There's so much, right? Wealth of knowledge and wisdom, right? That people of color, Black folks, have actually brought to us through their suffering. And I think, if we don't reach for these things, we have really sold ourselves short,
Hmm.
right? And the other thing I want to say is, get this on my chest, Shanna and Claude, um, is that, when we participate in systems of oppression, okay, whether we realize it or not, it takes away from our full humanity.
Hmm.
And so when we embark on this learning and we commit ourselves, right, to this responsibility of effecting change, really what we are engaging in is collective liberation.
Hmm.
We're setting one another free. And isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Right?
I love that, Su-Mei.
So yeah, so I feel like, let us learn together, right? When we talk about white supremacy, we're not attacking people's personal identities. You did not choose to be a white woman. You were born that way. Right? So we're not saying, oh, white supremacy is a bad thing and therefore Shanna is a bad person. We're not
Hmm.
saying that, right? We're talking about the systems that oppress, right? And so
Yeah.
if you are indifferent to how you have inherited privileges from such an oppressive system and you don't want to do anything about that, then maybe you might want to consider that maybe you're not a good person. Not to be participating in it, to perpetuate it, right? Even if you don't succeed, but you're trying, right? I think at least, you can say to yourself, I can die tomorrow knowing I have a clear conscience, right?
That's a really good point, Sume. I'm gonna link your resources when I put out this episode with the article so people can find that app and some of those authors. And they're like what I've learned too that's been really helpful for me on my journey of learning, like you say, is that, and I think this is something that we all have to unpack coming out of this church, is like me being comfortable entering this space and having these conversations, knowing that I'm going to screw it up sometimes, right? Like I'm probably going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to ask the wrong question, I'm going to make a mistake, and it's okay. And I can learn and I can do it differently next time, right?
Right, absolutely. There's grace and to spare. There's grace and kindness in this work,
Like someone once said about going to France, even if you mangle the language, if you try, you'll have a warmer welcome than if you just speak English loudly and slowly and expect them to respond in English, right? So it's the effort,
Mhm.
and I think that that's really the main thing. I mean, the first really the first thing, like Su-Mei pointed out from the start, the concept of race is a construct. It's not biological. It's not real. It's quite frankly, it's an imagined system of stratifying people. And I've heard this said many times, and people have probably heard it themselves, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. There is a human race. There's not human races. There is a human race. And then there are people who have different appearances within that, and they have different cultures within that. So if you were to imagine this planet and an alien came to this planet from somewhere else, they wouldn't start to order and say, oh, the black guy's worse and this one. They would just see humans. And whether they came to dominate all humans or befriend all humans, they would just see humans, right? They would just say, oh, well, they all look different. There's like a variety. They would probably look at us maybe like Skittles, like a bag of Skittles or something with all these colors and different shapes and sizes. But they wouldn't say, what, well, that's all these different races of, no, they would say, look at all these humans. There's such a variety of humans. And I think that when we start from that point of view and go out, I think that that's where the best start is. I know that we've constructed this particular discussion for ease and convenience and shorthand because they're known terms, black, white, right? White supremacy, right? Because they're structured, we're speaking in the terms of which this system works because they're understood shorthand terms. But really, in order to diffuse the system, is to understand that it is an imagined system. And there's no reason to prop it up because it oppresses those that it keeps under, but it also oppresses the people who feel like they have to stay propped at the top because they feel desperate. They feel like they're going to lose something if they're not holding themselves, even artificially, to this vaunted spot at the top. And so there's burden everywhere around it. That the system itself, it happens to funnel many benefits up to the preferred class within it. But that class itself also holds burdens. And so by abandoning it, you will free yourself. This whole construct of race, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate shorthand because it's the system that we currently operate in. But there's no reason that we should operate in it. And I think that to Su-Mei's point about getting curious, Baldwin, Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's a good book. I was mentioning to both Shanna and to Su-Mei that there are good writers on Substack. I was mentioning an author named Lovette Jallow, Jallow. She is a black, queer, neurodivergent woman in Sweden. And she's well educated and she's extremely perceptive. And she has really comprehensive writings. And so, yes, read black authors, read indigenous authors, read Asian authors, right? Because fact is, if I see something from someone indigenous, I read it because I don't know that perspective. And that's how I get to know that. If I see something from someone Asian, I should read it because I don't know all of their culture. I don't know all the history. And that's how I get to know it. So the curiosity is the thing. And is it work to do? Yeah, it's work, but it's work to learn anything. And the thing is when you are more knowledgeable, your life is enriched. And so, like we were saying to you, Shanna, to start, like how much we appreciate you and your willingness to put the work in, to get informed. Because the way this system is constructed, it's constructed in such a way that you could continue on your merry way
Yeah.
in with ease and not exert any effort to be curious. You
Yeah.
would be no worse off, but you consciously take the effort to know and to learn. And
And I
so
think
I
the reason is like you were talking about, Claude, when we lift everybody up, we lift ourselves up too, right? Like it's there. You were talking about indigenous authors. I have a favorite one. I've talked about her on CCF before, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she has a
Hmm.
quote that says all flourishing is mutual, and I love it so much, right? Like when we're all
Hmm.
connected and when we lift each other up and learn about each other, it's better for everyone, including those who are at the top of these created systems.
Yeah, because if you flatten the
You know,
system, we're all in the
it's
same spot, right? It's
you know, yeah, and it has been said that racism is very unimaginative. And when we feel that, life is a zero-sum game, if some advance, then others must lose. That is
Mm,
just a lack of imagination.
I love that.
We really have imprisoned ourselves within these walls that we've created for ourselves. The world is not a big enough place for all of us to thrive. How can that be?
I love that. Yeah, just seeing life from the viewpoint of abundance, right? Rather
right.
than scarcity.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
And then
And we know
it
that.
leaves us open for opportunities, right? Because we were
Yeah.
talking specifically in this discussion about romantic involvement, right? So
Hmm.
if everyone just kind of squeezes off into little factions that only look like themselves, there's a lot lost because
Hmm.
there's no introduction, there's no melding of cultures. Most of the advancement in the known world happened when cultures exchanged information, right? That's all the advancements that you see, mathematical concepts built because one culture talked to another.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Navigating the seas,
Yeah.
that developed because one culture spoke with another, right? So there's all these
yeah.
different things. So we've seen just development at large um, advance because of cultures mixing and mingling and getting to know one another and valuing each other. Then how much more so if we allow love and care to also mingle and mix among one another. It's so limiting for us to withdraw to different corners and different
Yeah.
factions and not embrace everyone's everyone's benefits, everyone's wisdom, right?
Hmm.
Because there's so much to be had to stack them and value one over another, or ignore
Yeah.
others for this one. It's limiting. But if we
Yeah.
value what all that's available, it's better for all of us.
Absolutely.
And it's fun, right, Claude?
Yeah,
And it's fun.
it's
And
fun.
We
fun is good.
underestimate. Yeah, it's just like like we underestimate just how much more interesting life
Yeah.
is, right? When we
Right.
reach for the
It
things that
is.
we don't know or and it's unfamiliar to us, right? It's really life-giving. I find that, so refreshing.
Yeah.
Why do I always just want to learn more about something that I already feel I know? Like it has to be something
Yeah.
that, I have to reach far out for,
Right.
right? And it's an act of, faith actually to do that
Hmm.
as well, right? And aren't we called by God to be people who have a vision of things that are not yet?
Mm.
Mm.
Like I feel like there's so much about Christianity that's meant to be life-giving, life-affirming, right? It's meant to lend us courage. And for some reason, we've taken that away,
Hmm.
right? Instead, we want to build prison walls, right?
Yeah.
Instead of, digging wells, right? We want to preserve,
Hmm.
right? Instead of, actually making things better, right? So I don't know. To me, coming back to your question, like learning resources, right? You're Go out and talk to someone who doesn't look like you.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? If you hate reading, you don't like reading, go on and engage someone who is not
Yeah.
like you.
Yeah. That's great
Rather than
advice.
talk to
Hmm.
someone whom you feel, oh yeah, probably they're the same as me. They'll echo all my thoughts, and they will share my values, and they won't challenge me. And I like that. Right?
Right.
Don't default to that, right?
Right.
You
Right.
know, the world is everything around you is available for you to learn something from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is really what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I very much agree. Yeah.
Yes. And in a culture where the sign of peace was comfort and just stay at peace, like that was considered peace, it's going to be difficult for a lot of folks watching this to embrace that challenge.
The
But I'm
discomfort,
gonna,
right? The discomfort of doing something
yeah,
new or different or
but I'm
trying
gonna
to
thank
someone's life.
everyone that watches this in advance for going out and getting curious because I have faith in you that you're gonna all go out and be curious. And I thank you in
It
advance for
won't kill
making
you. It
efforts.
didn't. It really didn't kill the cat.
Because
Oh, I love
I
that.
trust you all to get curious. I know that it's difficult. It is work. It is effort. But once you get started, you'll be amazed at what you didn't know, and you'll be amazed at how much richer your life is by knowing more about others.
And the relationships you can develop,
Yeah.
the fun you can have. Like, I think we really need to, especially coming from this church, like, think about those pieces too, right? Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. It really
So
isn't. There are no monsters
Yeah.
outside of
yeah.
those gates. There really is. It's all fake. Honestly, just get out. Break through the walls. Nothing happened to me. I'm fine. That's all I want to be.
You guys, this has been really amazing. Is there
Yes.
anything else you would like to share before we wrap up tonight that you didn't get to share?
I don't think so. I'm just thank you for this opportunity, Shanna, to have this discussion. I'm always appreciative when you open up the floor for these because
Thank you,
they're
guys.
always beneficial.
I appreciated this
Thank
so
you
much.
so
This is
much.
a
And
beautiful
thanks
conversation.
Su-Mei for joining us too. This has been
No,
really
thank you. Thank you both. You're
Next
amazing.
time, if we can make it happen in person, that would be awesome.
Oh, wouldn't it be
That would be the
great?
icing on the cake.
from your lips.
Well, Su-Mei and I are the closest, so maybe you can have this way, Claude.
Yes, that's true, actually.
I need to get more familiar with the Midwest, so yeah, sure.
Yeah, come
All
on
right.
over.
Yeah.
Come on over to the blurry middle.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.